It's time to get revved up with historic racing news. Here are your hosts, Paul Tarsey and Jim Roller.
Thank you, Bob Delano. Hello, everybody. I'm Jim Roller, coming to you from the Blue House Studios here on the shores of Lake Norman, and welcome to Rev It Up, Volume 1, Episode 1. Today, from our UK headquarters at the Newell House Studio, is our founder and my partner and dear friend, Paul Tarsey. Are you revved up, Paul?
Oh, I am revved up like you will not believe, Jim, and I'm really looking forward to this first of our Rev It Up podcasts, but we've got some really good stuff to talk about.
Oh, lots to talk about today. We've got the Goodwood Members Meeting, which you and Joe Bradley were at. We'll hear about that a little bit later. We'll also hear from the great Jacky Ickx, who was most recently the honoree at the 24th Amelia Island Concours d'Elegance, which you should have seen on our live stream, ladies and gentlemen. If you didn't see it last month, you can still go to historicracingnews.com and watch all the action. We've broken it up into 4 easy-to-watch sections for you. Jacky sat down exclusively with us. You might say, Paul, it was a very thought-provoking and deep conversation. There was deep thoughts from Jacky Ickx, weren't there?
Yeah, I didn't know Jacky Ickx back in the day when he was at the very top of his game as a racing driver, but he's absolutely very much at the top of his game as a human being now, because I think he's deep, he's thoughtful, he's considered. He obviously was very moved by the whole thing of Amelia Island and being the honoree there. But I think he's got racing and racing cars in perspective in his later life, I think.
Yeah, and our main topic today, we're going to be debating the 4 drivers that we thought should go into our Mount Rushmore of racing. If you're not familiar with Mount Rushmore in America, it's literally a mountainside in the Dakotas, and has faces carved in the mountain of the most significant people who helped shape America: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Teddy Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln. So Paul and I have picked 4 drivers we think are the most significant and are going to go on our Mount Rushmore. We've also, because there are so many great names out there, we wanted to make sure that we included a lot of them. So we've got those who might have been, and triers, and people why we didn't put them on the list. And I think that's probably where we should start, Paul. Go ahead and let's have yours first.
Okay, well, let's talk about the why nots. And on my list, I think that this is probably going to be the most contentious of any of this, which is going to be interesting to see. Because my list, my why nots, Jim Clark. And I put Jim Clark.
I'm stunned by that.
Well, yeah. I was thought about it a lot before I did it, but the truth is that Jim Clark was brilliant on his day. That put him in that little jewel-like Lotus 25, in the Lotus 49, later in his very short career. He was unstoppable, but Jim Clark was not good when he wasn't on his best day in the best car in the field. That he actually was one of these people who, and you have to go back to the Lotus sports cars, which originally it was the Lotus 30, which had a big Ford V8 in the back, at the kind of the beginning of the Can-Am era, and that it wasn't a success. That Jim Clark didn't have that psyche to say, I can think my way through it, and that this is not unique to Jim Clark, but I think it probably just edged him out of my Mount Rushmore of the top 4 drivers. The other people on my list were, and here's another one, wait for the bombshell, that Ayrton Senna. And Ayrton Senna just didn't make my list in the same way as Jim Clark just didn't make my list, simply because very much the same kind of thing. He came up by what we would now see as being the traditional route through what was then Formula Ford, Formula 3, Formula 2, into Formula 1, that he had that mercurial rise. He moved incredibly quickly through it. but we didn't see him in any other forms of motorsport. The third one, and I know I'm going to get an awful lot of stick from an awful lot of my sports car friends up and around the world, and that is Tom Christensen, because Tom Christensen is one of those people who, he did well in his early career in single-seaters, and he did well in touring cars before he made his fantastic success, particularly at Le Mans, winning 9 times. But I don't think we ever actually saw the best of Tom Christensen in those other formulae. And that for me is a kind of important measure as being the greatest drivers. This isn't about the greatest Formula One drivers, the greatest IndyCar drivers, greatest NASCAR drivers. It is the greatest drivers of all time.
I was shocked by Clark, but I'm not shocked by the other two. In fact, I've got one of them on my list, and the other one didn't even make my lists at all for the reasons that you said, and that was Tom Christensen. He is Mr. Le Mans, without a doubt. He is probably the greatest to ever race at that great racetrack, because it takes more than luck to win that race. It takes a lot of skill, and to win it 9 times. But he did it during the era of Audi, even though one of his wins came with BMW and the other was with a...
it was with a green Audi.
The Bentley. It was all during the Audi period. My first one is going to be a shocker for most Americans. In fact, I will probably get as much stick for this one as you're going to get for Jim Clark, and that's Mario Andretti.
Ooh, yeah.
Mario was he only won one Indy 500. The most famous words at the Indianapolis 500 are trouble for Mario Andretti. So, and everybody would say, well, that's just bad luck. And I would say, in fact, no, that's just you're too hard on your equipment. He had some endurance racing victories. He did well at Sebring, which some would argue is the hardest of all of the endurance races. But he was a great driver, but not really on the list. The next one for me would be Sterling Moss. Sterling Moss again, absolutely fantastic. If I was going to pick one driver to go out and get me pole position, he would be right up there along with Senna. Again, Sterling was never successful. He didn't like endurance racing. He wanted to go flat out all the time, and he made no bones about that. So that's what got him in the triers, but not on the list.
We could probably go on all for the next hour with people who were close to getting in. I noticed that neither of us has put Michael Schumacher on this list. I have really mixed feelings about this, because talk to people now who follow Formula One, follow modern Formula One, and they will say Senna was the greatest that ever lived, and Michael Schumacher was dirty. And
who do you learn it from?
That Senna invented dirty. I think that Schumacher only carried on doing what he had learnt from Ayrton Senna, and Michael Schumacher will be up there as one of the greats. He was a great Grand Prix driver, but he was only a great Grand Prix driver, I think. For me, on the triers list, Jim, there's one I think which I doubt if anybody would actually disagree with me about, and that's Graham Hill. Graham Hill, that we hear lots about Fernando Alonso trying to do the triple of the World Championship, the Indy 500 and the Le Mans 24 Hours. The only person who's ever done that was Graham Hill. And that I think even if Graham Hill were around today, he would tell you that he wasn't the fastest man on the grid, ever. That he just worked incredibly hard at getting the job done. And the other one is somebody who a lot of people won't have heard of, and that's a guy called Archie Scott Brown. Now, Archie Scott Brown was born with polio, and that he was born with both of his feet virtually facing backwards. He had no right arm, and he had a left arm and left hand, which was functioning, but that was all. And this guy drove the old Lister Jaguars, and many people will remember the Lister Jaguars of the 50s with the big 3.8 litre XK engine in them, and that he was incredibly quick. I mean, he was dicing with Sterling Moss, he was dicing with Maston Gregory, he was dicing with these kind of people in very, very similar cars, and that very frequently he won. And this is a man who was substantially, let's say, troubled by his various disabilities, and that for me, somebody who can overcome that, the authorities wouldn't give him a race license in the UK to start with. He battled that, and then he wouldn't get a international license either, and he battled that. And that and the sad thing is that he died in a race crash, but that was nothing to do with his disability per se. He was driving incredibly quickly, racing with Maston Gregory around Spa, and that he ran out of luck on that particular day, as so many people have at Spa. But Archie Scott Brown is my trier, but I'm intrigued to know who you've got, Jim.
One of them we've already talked about. That's Ayrton Senna, for all the reasons that we've already talked about. I would also put Graham Hill in this area. I would agree wholeheartedly. And my third and final one is Gilles Villeneuve. As a lad growing up, he was my favorite. Unfortunately, his bravado, as it were, ended up costing him, unfortunately, on a very sad day in 1982. And we never really found out what he could ultimately do with his career. So that's a pretty comprehensive list of folks. If you disagree with us, which I suspect you might, you can certainly let us know either through Twitter with the hashtag Rev It Up, or you can email us at revitup@historicracingnews.com.
Jim, before we go, and Gilles Villeneuve is also on my might have been list as well. I do have to tell my Gilles Villeneuve story, which is that he first came to Formula One prominence after he'd been running Formula Atlantic, and McLaren gave him a one-off run in the M23 at the Silverstone Grand Prix. I went to the first day of practice. I went to go home, and as we did when we were young and fit, we said, well, let's go and have a beer before we do the 100 miles home. So we're standing at the bar waiting to order. And you know how with those bars, there's always somebody at the end on a tall stool who sort of takes up residence, and they're there all the time. Well, there was one of those, and this chap said to me, have you been to the track today? And I said, yes, I have. And he said, was it good? I said, yes, very good. Any surprises? Yeah, I said, yes, there was one surprise, because there was a young lad there. He's Canadian, I think. He was in the third McLaren, and he was incredibly quick, and that he's going to be really good. And this chap sort of looked reasonably impressed, and that was good enough for me. At which point, the maitre d' came out from the dining room of the country club, walked behind me to the man standing next to me in the bar, and said, Mr. Villeneuve, your table's ready. Because I didn't know what Gilles Villeneuve looked like. So at least I was saying good things about him.
Good thing you didn't call him a prat.
Yes, exactly. And also, I've got Derek Warwick on my might have been list, and that is because
that's a good choice. Well, I agree with that. That's a good choice.
That was because we know that when Renault pulled out of Formula One, he was left without a drive, that he secured a drive with Lotus in their John Platt Special days, and that Ayrton Senna vetoed his appointment, and that's why Johnny Dumfries got the job, because Senna felt that Warwick would be a bit of a distraction for the team because he was close enough in pace to make all the difference, whereas that Johnny Dumfries, for the best one in the world, was going to be undeniably a second driver, a number 2 driver. So that's also on my might have been list.
So that's our might have beens and our have nots. Still to come, of course, is our 4 drivers that will be on our Mount Rushmore. But before we get that far, Paul, recently you enjoyed a day out at the members meeting at Goodwood with Joe Bradley. Now, it's kind of the spring coming out party for racing in England, isn't it?
It is, and bearing in mind that in the winter it's pretty cold even down in the south of England. Why the members meeting? Now, we've got to have a bit of a history lesson here, Jim, because where we are is that the Goodwood Circuit opened in 1948. It had been a World War II fighter base with Spitfires and Hurricanes flying out of it. They used the perimeter road as a racetrack, and so it was opened in 48 and it ran until 1966. It was still used for testing because that doesn't require a license, but back in the day, in that sort of 48 to 66 period, they used to have members meetings, and there was no restriction on how much racing they could do at Goodwood in those days. Goodwood has a club called the Goodwood Road Racing Club, and that the members meetings now are open to spectators who are members of the Goodwood Road Racing Club or their guests. So you probably see about a half of the number of people into Goodwood that you would see for Revival. With the members meeting is that it's kind of Goodwood for the racing fans rather than for the beautiful people.
So after the members meeting, Paul sat down with our contributor at large, Joe Bradley, at the Newell House studio. Probably it was over a cuppa, as Paul and Joe like to say. Enjoy a little tea and enjoy the conversation with Joe Bradley and Paul Tarsey talking about this year's members meeting from Goodwood.
Joe Bradley and I have been at the Goodwood Members Meeting, and it was a bit interesting, wasn't it, mate?
We somehow stepped into a time machine, didn't we, once again? And we went back to the early 60s, late 50s and beyond for some of this field. I love Goodwood. Goodwood, to me, is literally that, a time machine. It takes me back to when I first stood on a grassy bank at Croft Autodrome in the northeast, and I could, no debris fences. Hopefully that will remain. It's a bit tricky, isn't it? Safety over aesthetics. But for me, the ambience at the members meeting, I watch a lot of motorsport, Paul, as you know, across the world, but I look forward to the members meeting every year. And it's because of the nature of Goodwood, the nature of the circuit, the ambience that the Duke of Richmond creates, the attention to detail, not on the track, but off the track also. The whole thing, the whole package. It's a very rich fruit cake, which is just topped off with the sweetest icing with the on-track activity.
One of the things for me is that there is just so much, and that you go in and you almost have to make the decision, what am I not going to do? That you have to make the decision as to, well, I maybe won't, if I'm honest, bikes, for example, don't particularly float my boat, wonderful as they are. So as often as not, they will fall to the bottom of the list. But then you were saying to me that I know, went off and had a look at the bikes.
We had a look at the bikes. It would have, we found ourselves, Nick and I found ourselves searching for somewhere for a spot of lunch. And we got it from, would you believe, a NAFI van that was spelled NAFFI or something in the old military style. And it was done out like an old World War II NAFI style food van dispensing food. And we just happened to be right on the bike paddock. And there was some absolutely outstanding history there. I'm not in any way knowledgeable on bike racing, but I do know who Barry Sheene is, and Barry Sheene was a household name and probably still is, certainly in the United Kingdom. And he was one of our 1970s heroes. You turned on the TV and Barry Sheene was spraying deodorant on himself and probably some delectable looking
Yes,
model as well. So he was, a James Hunt kind of character. James Hunt and Barry Sheen.
They were great
were in
mates,
that,
weren't
great mates, but they were rock and roll, weren't they? Well, one of his bikes was there from his early career, and we did a little piece on it. You'll be able to hear it on the website, what we did, hear it and see it actually. Chatted to a chap called John Thompson, and he told us all about the story of how this bike was restored. It's a great listen. It's fascinating. The bike is not for racing, and it'll explain why on there. But I've always, having raced myself and and knowing the psyche of racing and how the commitment, and I don't just mean the financial commitment or the lifestyle commitment, I mean the commitment when you drive a car on the very edge. I am absolutely astonished as to how anyone can race a bike on the limit. Racing a historic bike on the limit, which we saw those bikes going around at Goodwood, and the sweeps and the thing about Goodwood is it's an old style circuit. There aren't any stop start. There aren't any right angled corners. They're all then there's not one constant radius turn at Goodwood.
No, they're all double apex.
They're all double, triple, quadruple apex going into the same. And those guys on those bikes, I mean, all right, there's not a racing line around Goodwood in a car. There are several racing lines around Goodwood in a car.
But that's what makes the racing good, sorts of things. And we saw that fantastic mini race. Which, and so many different lines that were being followed. Some intentionally, some not.
It was possibly one of, if not the best ever motor race I have witnessed.
Wow!
And I was in the grandstand on the outside of Woodcut, which is the again, pick a line, try and get the speed off before you turn right, and then sort out the car for the chicane. And it was a passing place. It's off the Levant Straight, which is the fastest part of the Goodwood circuit. Those mini boys were, as Nick Swift, who went on to win the race and win the Betty Richmond Trophy. He said that to race a mini, you've got to be out of control most of the time. And they certainly looked out of control. I'm sure they weren't. It was precision driving. It was fantastic. And you know what, Paul? Excuse me. There was no touching. No. Inch perfect, nose to tail, bumper to bumper, without any kind of barging that we see in modern racing. That's just, I can't get past you, so I'm going to push you out the way with a little nudge in the braking area.
That
None of that. We're racing old cars, beautifully restored. Yes, beautifully restored. However, they're still old cars. They're still old technology.
Yeah.
And motor racing was dangerous back in the 50s and 60s.
But going back even further than that, we saw those pre-First World War cars out racing. And they talk about the whole thing of, you can only see the top of a modern single-seater driver's crash helmet, because that's about all that you're able to see through the crash structures. You could see these guys' feet.
You could see the whole body on some of them. They were basically... a couple of the cars looked like the drivers were on beer crates, sat on beer crates, pushing pedals and levers and steering wheels. But if you think about it, Paul, these cars were around in the very beginning of motorsport, when carts, contraptions were pulled by horses. Remove the horses, attach an engine from invariably an old World War I aircraft that was lying in a shed, attach it to this cart in some way, engineer it into to turn an axle, and then what we're going to sit on. Let's we're going to have to sit up there, and it was very much the advent of the automobile and people turning carts, which were horse-drawn carts, into automobiles, and you can see their evolution, and we saw that full evolution of the motor car, of the automobile at Goodwood at the weekend, didn't we? We saw those turn of the 20th century cars, which were the very first cars built and raced, right up to modern day examples on the stands and what have you.
For me, again, with those cars, there's not only no safety protection, there is nothing. There's the beer crate that they're sitting on and a steering wheel coming out of the floor. and those cars were doing 90 miles an hour.
Yes, I
and
know.
can you imagine sitting in a 90 mile an hour wind like that?
And not just that. All right, you get into a cart and you do 100 miles an hour on a thing that resembles a tea tray. However, these things are high off the ground.
Yep.
They're on very skinny tyres. They're moving around. They're bouncing around. The drivers are not strapped in. So there's the odd times over the weekend you saw their backsides actually lift off the seat as they went across the bumps and stuff, and they were, they're hanging on for grim death, quite literally.
Yes. Yeah, I think that they for me could well be the highlight, but also that whole piece of the Saturday night celebrations. And that we stood and talked, didn't we, about the fact that that's something you and I have both done our fair share and more of 24-hour races over the years. There is nowhere in the world that does evening entertainment at a race circuit like Goodwood.
No, I was blown away the first time I ever went to Goodwood for the members meeting. The members meeting is the racers meeting, isn't it? It is does what it says on the tin. It's the racing members, the club members meeting. The revival is a little bit different. There's more people there. It is what it is. The revival has an even different ambience. But the members meeting for me is not just a race meeting. It's a festival of everything. And again, the Duke of Richmond's attention to detail. And then the school, the public school kind of theme to the whole event with the team competition, which was, I've got to say, was a bit odd. And the first time I went there with my friend Tim Vendergast, who's an American, I couldn't get my head around it, so he had no chance of getting his head around. The team captains walking around in their blue and white striped blazers there. It's not just about the competitors, that bit though. As a spectator, you get assigned to a house, and the activities that are open to you, and I've got to mention one, was axe throwing. Target axe throwing. Which had a huge queue. If there wasn't such a queue and I'd had the time, I would have had a go at it. It's not as easy as it looks. But as a spectator, you're there. You take part in those activities, you're scoring points for the house, that those drivers out on the track are accruing points as well. So you're part of that whole team, that whole schoolhouse. It's just a wonderful experience. It's a bit like a motorsport Disneyland for a weekend. So on the theme of the school, the boarding school, the public school thing with the competition going on for the 4 houses, there are people whose job it is to walk around Goodwood dressed as teachers, old style, with the what's those hats called? Mortarboard hats, and they're actors. They are hired actors by Goodwood, and they walk around. And they will dress you down like you are a naughty schoolboy or schoolgirl. And we saw that many times. Yes. Nick and I are walking by, and there's the 3 teachers. Then the young female teacher looks at Nick and goes and says, "And you can stop smirking." Hilarious. And we saw that middle-aged guy getting a right dressing down.
Yes, and the beauty of that is that some people get it and some people don't.
Yes, thankfully he got it. Yeah. I think he was being chastised for his state of his moustache.
Yes, yes, I think it was.
But it's taken in good spirit. But it's brilliant. I mean, who thought of that, Paul?
Yeah.
Who thought of let's have some actors walking around as teachers, chastising everybody and picking faults with everybody, which is exactly what would happen in a school.
But it's that whole thing is somebody sitting in a planning meeting. I want to go to a Goodwood planning meeting.
Yes,
I want to go to a Goodwood planning meeting.
It would be quite a creative environment you'd be in there.
Yes, I know what. Let's have some teachers.
Let's have some sharks with laser beams, and they would achieve it.
Yeah.
Brilliant, just a brilliant weekend. And if what I would urge people to do, if you're a motorsport fan, this is beyond enjoyable. It is up. It's kind of up.
Well, Paul, it sounds like you and Joe had a whale of a time at the members meeting this year. Well, maybe next year I can get that on my list to come over for the for the members meeting. Was it as much fun as you guys made it sound?
It was, absolutely. And I think the only trouble I have these days, actually, Jim, is that the size of the bucket for my bucket list is getting bigger and bigger.
That was Paul Tarsey. I'm Jim Roller. We hope you're enjoying Rev It Up from historicracingnews.com. Well, it's time for our countdown. We'll go. I'll go first, and then Paul will go. We'll go one at a time, I think, Paul, and counting down to our final one. Or, well, actually, I'm going to let you go first. But let's alternate. You can start. You can.
All right then. My 4 for our Mount Rushmore is going to be Alain Prost.
Ooh, interesting choice.
The reason that I've put him down is he was that incredible mixture of being very, very quick, but also an absolute thinker. And I think also a nice guy. Within the content of it being a Formula One driver. But I think Alain Prost was one of those people when he was driving that he was super reliable, that he didn't make mistakes, but at the same time he was quick. I mean, anybody can drive at 9.5 tenths and not fall off, because that's one thing. But when you're driving at 10.5 tenths and that you're still reliable, strong, dependable, and everything else, I think that Alain Prost, for me, is the definition of what that was about.
Well, my number 4 we've already talked about a little bit, and that's Jim Clark. And the reason he's number 4 is partly for part of the reasons that you had him where you had him on your list, in that while he may have been the best when he had the great equipment, he might not have been the best when he didn't. But he also had the most fragile equipment. And I think that he was just so good. And then he raced in Indianapolis. And to me, as an American, I give him a lot of credit for that. And I may weigh that a little bit heavier than you do, Paul, because of my roots. Anybody that will tell you, especially back in the 60s when they were making the transition from the front engine to the rear engine cars at Indianapolis, that was a tough place to go race. They didn't cotton too well to foreigners there at the Indianapolis 500. He raced there consecutively from 1963 to 1967. He had 2 second place finishes and, of course, the famous win in 1965. And while win in 1965 was great, I think that the fact that he started 5th and finished 2nd in 1963, and only some bad luck and some mechanical issues kept him from winning that race, is probably the greatest performance the man ever had.
Yeah, you see, the thing with Jim Clark is that all of those things are right. All of those things are correct. That he was, statistics don't lie. To my mind, Jim Clark was as much part of the cocktail that Colin Chapman put together as was monocoque construction for the Lotus 25, as was the genius of the stress member for the engine in the Lotus 49, for all of those things. Yeah, I hear what you say absolutely about the whole thing of Indy, and that he conquered that. But I think, had Colin Chapman said, we're going to go rallying, or we're going to do the Baja 1000, or that Jim Clark would have done it, because he just did as Chapman told him to do.
I suspect if Colin Chapman ever wanted to go to Baja, the Lotus would break when he took it off the transport.
There is that.
Who's your number 3?
My number 3 is, and I suppose I'm extending this thing about the personality as well as the figures, the statistics, because my number 3 is Niki Lauda. And Niki Lauda, because, again, blindingly quick as a race driver, that's incredibly, incredibly good at what he did. And he developed through the years that his accident at the Nürburgring in 76 undoubtedly would have killed 90% of lesser men. That he was just so determined, and that even now, when I think of the fact that 6 weeks later, having been given the last rites, he was racing at Monza, is, it just stuns me as to the bravery of the man and the dedication of the man. And I think for me, if you're putting those people up on Mount Rushmore, in the same as the real Mount Rushmore, you're not just talking about the achievements, you're talking about the bravery, you're talking about the determination. But he's an amazing man and an amazing human being, as well as being an incredibly quick race driver. So that's why he's on my list.
That's a good one. And I can't discount anything that you've said. I agree with you 100% about everything you said. My reason for not putting him on any of my categories is simply the fact that he really only was a Formula One racer. I will never forget, as a young man, being at the Watkins Glen Grand Prix in 1976. And the epitome of toughness is Niki Lauda. I watched him in the pit lane as a young cub reporter take his helmet off, and his balaclava was soaked with blood. And he would literally peel the balaclava off, and then they would bandage his wounds again and everything else. That was the end of that season was certainly the most heroic thing I have ever seen from a race car driver ever, bar none. So, third on my list is Dan Gurney.
Oh.
and Dan is there for the fact that he won Le Mans, he won a Grand Prix, he won 5 NASCAR races, I'm sorry, in his lifetime. He won in Trans Am. He started in 1959. He raced for Ferrari. He was a Porsche factory racer. He raced for Brabham. And most importantly, he raced for All-American Racers, or Anglo-American Racing, as it was called when he raced the Westlake. He was the first person to ever build and drive his own car to a Grand Prix victory. Everyone thinks, well, what about Bruce McLaren? Well, Bruce McLaren did it in 1968. Dan Gurney did it in 1967 at Spa. That happened to be the same year that he won the 24 Hours of Le Mans with A.J. Foyt. And he extemporaneously sprayed the champagne and started a tradition that it forever lives to this day of spraying the champagne. He, as a car owner, dominated IMSA with his Toyota GTP cars. Gurney Eagles won multitudes of Indy 500s. And he was an all-around nice guy. I think the Dan Gurney story that I remember the best, Paul, is right after Bruce McLaren was killed. Dan basically gave up his aspirations to be the Can-Am champion to help the McLaren team carry on and Denny Hulme to win the championship, because without that, the team was teetering on the edge, and Dan stepped in and was a kind of an anchor to windward for the team and helped them to go on. And don't forget, we've talked a lot in this show about Jim Clark. Roger Horton, in his book Remembering Jim Clark, tells the wonderful story of at Jim Clark's funeral, Jim's dad pulling Dan Gurney aside and saying, Dan, Jim, you were the only man that Jim Clark ever worried about.
Yeah.
So I think that's high praise, and those are the reasons I put Dan Gurney number 3 on my Mount Rushmore.
And I think you and I are coming to
argue with that, big boy.
No, I'm not going to, because I think you and I are both coming to a similar kind of conclusion here, which is that it's not just about the statistics, because anybody can do that. It's about the people and the other stuff that they achieved. And Dan Gurney absolutely is there on my list for that. And moving up to my number 2, somebody, again, that we've talked about a bit, Jacky Ickx. Because, that if Tom Christensen has become known as Mr. Le Mans, Jacky Ickx was known as Monsieur Le Mans for many, many decades prior to that. 6 times winner of Le Mans. But, and this is why he's on my list, he was a mighty fine driver, excluding all of his Le Mans stuff. That I can remember being at Brands Hatch and seeing him overtake round the outside of Paddock Bend in the wet when he was driving a Lotus 72 John Player Special. Now, Paddock Bend, for those who don't know it, is an off-camber, downhill, blind apex corner. That's amazing. He was a brilliant Formula One driver. He was a driver for Brabham, for Lotus. He did all of those great things. And that, again, in my ticks in boxes piece, that the ticks in the boxes that say, okay, so is he worthy of being on this list as a human being? The answer is an absolute yes. Good guy through and through, and that we'll be playing our interview that you had, Jim, with Jacky Ickx, and that's fascinating to hear what he says.
In fact, we're going to do that right after I do my number 2. He was Mr. Le Mans before Mr. Le Mans was cool. He has a sense of elegance about him that comes with being a man of a certain age. My number 3 is Juan Manuel Fangio.
Number 2.
Yes. Sorry, number 2. Yes, thank you. My number 2 on this list is Fangio. And everybody said, well, wait a minute. You said that, well, he did race other things. He won at Sebring. He had great performances in other forms of racing. He was known for Formula One, but he dominated in a time when you were lucky to survive. And he not only survived, he lived to the ripe old age of 84 years of age. He had the highest percentage of wins. He had 24 wins out of 52 entries. He had the highest number of pole positions, 29 pole positions out of 52 entries. You know, he was the oldest world champion at 46 years of age. And here's something. He won world championships with 4 different teams: Alfa Romeo, Ferrari, Mercedes, and Maserati. And who will ever forget the great run on the Nordschleife when he had to come in and change the tire and started, rejoined the race dead last or nearly dead last, and came back and won the race. Juan Fangio was a gentleman. He was even kidnapped once, so he wouldn't compete in a race. Could you imagine kidnapping Michael Schumacher? No, but they did kidnap Fangio. So I put Fangio as my number 2.
I can imagine kidnapping Lewis Hamilton, but that's something entirely different. Yeah, and they do tell the story of, or did tell the story of, that Fangio's final race was at Reims in France. Mike Hawthorne was leading the race and came up to lap Fangio and wouldn't lap him because it was the end of the race, and that he would not put the great Fangio a lap down, which probably says it all for the respect that the man was held in across the whole of the grid. So yeah, I'm not going to argue with that one, Jim, because I think that one is absolutely right that he should be there, and I'd love to argue with you, but I can't because you're right, and you won't hear me say that very often.
What a good segue you make, though, Paul, because you're talking about the respect that Mike Hawthorne had for Juan Fangio. One of the things we discovered when we talked to Jacky Ickx, and it's one of the reasons I agree that he should be on your Mount Rushmore, is that he did have a very good opportunity to win the world championship in 1970 when, unfortunately, Jochen Rindt was awarded the world championship posthumously. He's the only posthumous world champion. After he passed away, Jacky had the opportunity to win the world title. He was Rindt's main protagonist in that battle, and he felt very squeamish about that and really had no desire after the loss of Rindt to win the championship. And that's part of what we discussed when we caught up with him at the Amelia Island Concours d'Elegance. And we'll take a listen to a very reflective Jacky Ickx now, and then afterwards we'll give you our top 2 on our Mount Rushmore. Jacky, when you were a young boy, what caused you to become interested in racing?
Well, I think you are going to be surprised because I never wanted to be a racing driver, and I don't even dream about cars. I thought my future was being a gardener or a gamekeeper. So you can see it's far away from motor racing. But if you want some advice on how gardening, yes, I can do it.
How did it start?
Well, it started, I think first of all you have to be a very bad at school. It helped a lot, because your parent doesn't know what to do with you, you know, and they fear the future is going to be tough. So it makes them to understand that, like all the parents, you have to look for something your son or your daughter may do well. And amazingly, I received. Worse I was at school, more gift I received. So one day I received a motorcycle, and with that motorcycle, rather than being last, I've started to know the pleasure of to be within the first three. And then the rest is pure destiny and providence. That means every year, every season, there was something new to do. And then once it was a car, and then in cars I had a faster car, and faster and faster. As I behaved reasonably well, I was reasonably quickly with the top team, and then I enter in the car world and the racing world for the best. I don't think my parents were very happy, I mean, because they suffer a lot. I came from an era where motorsport was very dangerous. So my mother and my father were fairly sick on Monday of having suffered from the angst of anything may happen. And you know, in those days it's not like today. The communication were not the same. TV was small, so to pick up some news wasn't that easy. It has to be said that I am the result. I am the result of timing and places, but mainly because I had a chance to drive good cars. And I say that to remember you that if you don't have the right people surrounding you, if you don't have a project who is perfect like I used to have, you have a bunch of people you never see who give you a winning tool, that means a car, and probably the sadness in a way, because there is some sadness in it, is that you pick up all the glory, and the others have only the intellectual satisfaction to have done their job well. Of course, the quality of satisfaction is more pure because it's basic. And in life, that goes for everyone in life. You need to be well surrounded, you need the providence, you need a teacher, you need a book, a friend, an advice who can change your life. But as I said, amazingly, I never did what I wanted, but I'm not going to say it in a way it's a regret.
Yeah.
It just happened.
What was your favorite Formula One car? Was it the Ferrari, the 312B? Was it something else?
Well, you never hear a driver saying he dislikes a car when he's winning. He has much better memories on those cars. He had some hopes or never worked, and our cars are difficult to drive with a lot of mechanical problems and so on. But I've been very privileged in the way that I come from an era where there were no exclusivities, there were little money, so you didn't have the problem of the money. There were the sponsors were almost unexisting, so I've been able to do a lot of things in good condition. And that include the Can-Am series, for example, for Carl Haas, the Formula One, 5 years with Ferrari, 10 years with Porsche, Formula 2, Saloon Car Racing, Paris-Dakar. So it was an era where all the drivers at the time had the time and also the freedom to compete in any kind of categories. And I cannot say there are preferences. When you win, because it's all about winning. It's not about speed or the pleasure to take a corner at 300 kilometers. No, the feeling comes from the fact that you may be part of the good ones and sometimes win important races. It's easy after a career to describe your history and to analyze your history, but clearly I was privileged, as I say, in the surrounding. You have to understand that you're not alone. Your ego pushes you to believe you are alone, but you're not. And that's the basic reflex in everybody's life is to say, yes, I met someone one day who changed my life. I read a book one day who changed my life. It's a sentence sometimes.
Yes.
Who change your mind. Our life is based on choices. You turn life, it takes one direction. Left, you take a direction. You turn right, it's another direction. In my case, it looks very good. It is very good. It's a fact. Number one, because I'm still alive, and I come from a very dangerous era, if I may say so. So I'm one of the survivors. I had an extremely good guardian angel. He was flying very well. He was giving me good advices, but he suffered also. Suffer a lot.
In 1970, you didn't win the championship. You had a chance to, and I've been told that there was some trepidation on your part because you felt a little uneasy if you'd have won the championship after Jochen had his untimely accident.
What you have to know, anyhow, is that clearly, if you mention it, Jochen Rin, who died in September, 4 races before the end, had more points than me. We were close together, but mathematically, he has more points than me. And I think it would have been a nightmare to win a championship with someone who wasn't there to defend himself. So I think also I was very privileged not winning the championship that year, because it would have been like stealing something in a way, and nothing to be proud of. So things were well made, things went well on that aspect. He deserved to be the champion, and happy he was a champion.
As a man who won as much as you did, was so successful, and as you say, was very lucky to survive the most dangerous era in motorsports, probably. What do you think of racing today?
They are two different planets. What I've known, like Mario Andretti, knew, because Mario Andretti has some similarities. He was able to do everything, and he has been successful in almost everything. It's not comparable. We come from another era. The danger was so much greater that you cannot even compare it.
So, Paul, that was an interesting conversation, and frankly, I was shocked by how reflective he was, but that was consistent throughout the entire weekend.
It was. He was very reflective. And the other thing I think which doesn't necessarily come over in that interview is just how incredibly cool that man is. He is the coolest of cool individuals. That he looks great. He's something over 70 now. He presents immaculately. That he talks to everybody. And I think one of the things was that he was walking around the show field there at Amelia, and that he was being asked the same questions time after time after time with that display of cars that was there, and he just answered all the questions patiently, politely, and with enthusiasm. He's just such a nice guy.
Well, you're listening to Rev It Up with historicracingnews.com. I'm Jim Roller, and that was Paul Tarsey. It's time now for our theme of the day to be drawn to a conclusion as we pick our top person to lead the way, to hold the George Washington position of Mount Rushmore. And so, Paul, with a cheesy drum roll here.
Yep.
I will give you the honor of giving me your number one on the Mount Rushmore of motorsport.
Now, this is utterly subjective. This is very, very personal. But
aren't they all?
Well, yeah, I suppose they probably are. Personal, but for a whole host of reasons, which I'll talk to you about, is Stirling Moss. Stirling Moss, who is, for me, the greatest race driver of all time. You had him down as one of your why nots, and I think that the point you made is very valid, that he didn't like sports car racing, but he didn't like sports car racing because he couldn't drive hard enough. Now, we know that sports car racing in 2019 is a series of sprints between the refueling stops. That's all it is, and they're driving at...
Oh, he'd have loved it. He'd have loved it today.
He would. Because
he'd give Tom Christensen a run for his money.
Yes, and that back in the day, that drivers were sent out, told to drive at 8/10, and that famously John Wyer, who probably was one of the greatest team managers of all time when he was running the Aston Martin team, which of course won at Le Mans in 1959, that he would sit down before every endurance race and he would work out what the lap time needed to be to win based on prior performance, on what the opposition was doing. And that's what the cars were told to do. And you can imagine somebody like Stirling Moss, who was a racer through and through, that he hated that, but he was one of these people who he went from different car to different car, and that this is where I have to put my hand on my heart, or my heart on my sleeve perhaps, and say that where we were with that was he was part of the entry for the first ever Grand Prix that I went to. And this is where I say in very large letters, as a very young child, because that was in 1959. And that I can still remember it.
That's the year I was born.
Well, there you are. I am just that little bit older than you. And that in 1959, my parents took me to Aintree, which is, of course, a horse race circuit and the home of our Grand National horse race. But for just a short period of time, they used what was the Link Road as being the home for the British Grand Prix. And that in our household, I was a Stirling Moss fan through and through, and my younger brother was a Jack Brabham fan through and through. And do you know what? That Australian went and won the 59 Grand Prix, but Stirling came second. And for me, that's probably what really got me involved in this sport back then. And when I tell you that it was Jack Brabham in that fearsome rear-engine Cooper, and second place was Stirling Moss in a front-engined BRM P25, that was a sea change in Formula One and in Grand Prix history. But I think for me, Moss was a hero, and we don't get many of those. That we don't get people who... Stirling Moss was the first motorsport celebrity. He was everything that people wanted to be, and he did everything. He raced in sports cars, he raced in single seaters, he raced in lower formulae single seaters, he drove in rallies, he did the Monte Carlo rally, he did almost everything you can think of, and he did that. And he said unashamedly that he did it because that's where he got paid. He got paid as a driver, and the drivers didn't get these huge retainers and exclusive contracts that they get now. But he was everywhere, and that it's perhaps ironic that he was there in my first Grand Prix, and I was at Goodwood the day that he had his career-ending accident, which, again, I talked about Niki Lauda, but that would have killed a lesser man, and that Sterling was in a coma for 6 weeks after that, and that certainly in the UK, it was front page news virtually every day for those 6 weeks of an update on the condition of Sterling Moss, because he was this celebrity, this superhero, and that the huge irony is that he held himself back by wanting to drive British cars, and that was at a time when British cars perhaps weren't the best. He went to Mercedes in 1955, but insisted on there being a big Union Jack on the side of his car. Bearing in mind, this is 10 years after the end of the Second World War. So he wanted a big Union Jack on the side of his car, but he had sort of seen the light in that he had his big accident in 62, and he had done a deal that for the following year, he would actually be running what was a factory Ferrari in Rob Walker colours, which satisfied his needs to be driving something which was kind of British, but at the same time to be driving the same sort of car. Now, John Surtees went on to win the World Championship in that car that Moss would have been driving. So you can put that where you like. The cliche has always been Sterling Moss is the greatest driver never to have won the World Championship. But I think for me, he's just hero with a capital H.
Indeed, I wouldn't argue with any of that. And hero definitely is the first thing you think of. I think that some of his you were talking about he would go and race where he was paid, but I think his nationalism and his pride in being an Englishman may have limited his ability to perhaps win the World Championship, because he wasn't willing to sell out to go just to necessarily to the best team all the time. But who will ever forget his Mille Miglia win? That record still stands. And a couple years ago, I got to spend the day with Sterling Moss and that car at a friend's ranch outside of Jacksonville, Florida, when Mercedes came over and did some filming after the Amelia Island Concourse when Sterling was the honoree. And that will forever be etched in my memory of one of the greatest days I've ever had being in and around racing. And I'll tell you, if it was for a kid growing up in Watkins Glen, we even knew who Sterling Moss was. I can remember the local police telling this wonderful story of pulling over someone for speeding in the 60s. It was about 1965 actually, and pulled the gentleman over in downtown Watkins Glen and said, "Who do you think you are, Sterling Moss?" And the chap in the car looked up and says, "Well, man, yes, that's exactly who I am." So,
yes.
so the cop had no choice but to let him go. My number one, the man at the top of my Mount Rushmore, for many of the same reasons, Paul. He's a hero. He's an American hero. I know you're surprised by this one. He is, to me, the greatest race car driver to ever live, and that's AJ Foyt.
Wow.
He has accomplished probably more than anybody else. He raced at Indy, where he's made famous. He raced on dirt. He raced stock cars and won. He raced at Le Mans and won. He raced at Daytona and won. He raced at Sebring and won. The first time he raced a Porsche, it was in 1983. He jumped in a Porsche 935 Moby Dick Whaletail and set the fastest lap in the rain in a car he'd never even seen before, let alone sat in or practiced in. AJ Foyt raced at the Indianapolis 500 35 consecutive years. He was the first to win 3 times. He's the only driver to have won the Indy 500 in rear engine and front engine cars. As I said, he's the only driver to win Le Mans and the Indianapolis 500 in 1967. He's the only one to do it in the same year. Obviously, we talked about Graham Hill. He won the Indy 500, the Daytona 500, the 24 hours of Daytona, 24 hours of Le Mans, and the 12 hours of Sebring. He's the only person to win all of those races. I did a little research before I came. I came loaded for this.
I'm getting that feeling.
He had 12 major driver championships in various categories. He won 138 USAC races, which is the United States Auto Club. So that's on dirt, on pavement, short ovals, big 1 mile ovals. That is a complete overview of everything you can race in America. He won the International Racing Champions Championship, the IROC Series, twice in 76 and 77. He won 7 NASCAR races. He and Mario Andretti are the only 2 people to win the Indianapolis 500 and the Daytona 500. AJ Foyt went on as a car owner and has won the Indianapolis 500 as a car owner. Is got personality to beat the band. People, the scenes of him, throwing the computer laptop across the pit lane, banging on the turbo with a ball peen hammer and things. AJ was not above getting out of the car and helping the mechanics, whether they needed the help or not. And he is both in ability, accomplishment, and personality to me what a racing driver. You want tough? That's tough. And he still carries on today at the ripe old age. I think he's 84 now.
Wow. So there you have it. That I think the summary for this would be that we weren't just looking at achievements, and that we were looking at race drivers as people, as human beings, as role models, as some of the great and the good that we can all look up to. We've had AJ Foyt and Sterling Moss as being our choices respectively, but we haven't really talked about all sorts of people. That yes, you can get your views and send it to us at Rev It Up at historicracingnews.com, and let us know your thoughts and let us know what you think, because when we do our next podcast, we'd love to include some of your ideas as to who the great and the good should be.
This has been fun, Paul. You had some surprises. I had some surprises for you. And we did not talk to each other about this ahead of time as to who our top 4 were going to be. So that was kind of fun. Hope you've enjoyed Rev It Up, Volume 1, Episode 1. As Paul said, we'd like to hear your opinions, either at the website that he mentioned, the email address, which is revitup@historicracingnews.com, or tweet us, #RevItUp. For Paul Tarsey, I'm Jim Roller. Check us out at historicracingnews.com. Until next time, enjoy the races.